marathon on Thursday. She spent 8 hours fielding questions in front of the longest-running Select Committee in the history of the United States Congress. At issue was the deadly 2012 attack on an American diplomatic compound in Benghazi, Libya. And at the end, the committee's Republican chairman conceded there were no big revelations. We reached out to all of the Republican members of the Select Committee to appear on this program. Of those who responded, none were available. Representative Adam Schiff is one of the Democrats on the committee. I am pleased to have him here to get a sense of where we are and where we might be going in this investigation. Congressman Schiff, welcome to the program.
Thank you. It's great to be with you.
Where are we and where are we going?
Well, it's a good question, and it's very hard to say. All of the other hearings that were planned for this year were canceled once the hearing with Secretary Clinton was scheduled. There were initially going to be about 10 or 12 hearings, some with the Defense Secretary, with the head of the CIA, but those were all put off or canceled for good. So we're waiting to hear from the majority, and of course we'll have to evaluate based on their plan going forward what that means in terms of our participation. There has been a debate all along about whether it makes sense for Democrats to participate in what we view as a highly partisan exercise designed to attack the Secretary. So we're going to have to see what they plan in the future and make a decision about that.
Is it likely that you will not go forward, Democrats?
Well, our ranking member is issuing a statement that we intend to continue participating for now, but a lot will depend on where they intend to take this. To be honest, Charlie, I don't think they know yet where they want to take this. Everything has sort of been leading up to the moment we had last night, and I think they're in the process of evaluation. How much longer do they want this to drag on, and what is the objective? We tried, from the very beginning of this investigation to get them to agree to some scope, if not a scope in terms of the time of the investigation, at least to identify what issues we were trying to unravel, whether it was the allegation of a stand-down order or whether it was some other issue. But they were unwilling to essentially narrow or even define the scope. So we're not really sure where we're headed, to be honest.
Have you asked for the release of the transcripts of the interviews with Sidney Blumenthal?
We have many times. We asked for them. Frankly, this was a deposition which is governed by the House rules. We were entitled to have a vote on the release of those transcripts. We asked promptly after his deposition to have that vote. The Republicans would never schedule the vote. They didn't want to have to vote on this. As you saw last night, we forced a vote on it during the middle of this hearing. And to a person, the Republicans all voted to keep those transcripts private, which is very curious because they were willing to release Sidney Blumenthal's emails selectively. He's the only witness they've done that for. But they weren't willing to release the transcript of his explanation of the context of those emails. And I think, Charlie, the reason is pretty clear. It wasn't so much what he said in that private deposition, but what they asked him. Because the GOP members have been going on national TV to say they're not interested in the Clinton Foundation and they're not interested in the personal relationship he had with the Clintons. But in fact, when you look at the questions that were asked, there were literally hundreds of questions about the foundation, about media matters, about the relationship he had with the Clintons, and almost nothing about the events of Benghazi.
Tell me what you think the big questions were and what the answers were.
Well, I'll tell you what the big questions were at the outset of all of the investigations, because we have to put this in context. This is now the 8th or 9th investigation. In the very beginning, after these tragic events, there were very legitimate questions about was the security enough? Were there requests made for additional security that went unheeded? Who was responsible for that? How do we improve security in the future? What happened afterwards? Why were the talking points wrong? Those were all legitimate questions. But by the time this investigation started, they had all been pretty well asked and answered, which was the challenge, frankly, in defining what we were going to do new in this investigation. Now, there have been these persistent myths out there about stand-down orders, about gun running, about interference in security. So it was pretty clear we were going to go and do yet another look at that. But what I think is so telling about this, and this was intimated by the chairman at the conclusion of the Clinton hearing, and that is, notwithstanding all the witnesses we've talked to and all the interviews, all the documents we've received, all the emails that have been so talked about, there's really been nothing new discovered that alters any of the core conclusions that were made in these other 8 investigations. So we don't have much to show for a year and a half worth of work, in the sense that we can't tell the families or the American people anything particularly new about those tragic events.
Are you bothered by the fact that the Secretary of State did not know about the request for additional security?
Well, I think the Secretary answered that quite well yesterday. It wasn't the first time she's been asked. There are people who are responsible for the security at all of our consulates and embassies. That's who did receive the ambassador's request for additional security. And frankly, I don't know as a policy matter whether I would want the Secretary of State, who's got a very big job, to be micromanaging decisions about whether there should be 6 security personnel or 8 or 10 or what the level of setback of a facility ought to be. There are people whose expertise and job that is in the State Department. There may be rare circumstances where, the key question, do we keep this facility open, goes to the Secretary. I think that's perfectly appropriate. And those questions did go to her. Yes.
But in this case, this was someone that she knew and admired. And if he was requesting additional security, you might assume that somehow it would get to her.
Well, it might have, and it didn't. And I think, the fact that they did have a relationship and that this was someone that she chose for this position, I think indicates also that if Ambassador Stevens thought that she was the right person and to make these decisions, he would have been able to go to her. In fact, there's a mechanism for her to go to her within the State Department. The reality, too, though, is the Secretary has a relationship with all of these ambassadors around the world. Now, some obviously more than others, but we have to put this in perspective. There were 20 capitals that seemed under siege at this time when that video took place, and there were numerous other hotspots around the world that the Secretary also had to deal with, a lot of very dangerous posts. And so, whether this particular request should have gotten to her, the answer is it didn't get to her, and I think it's hard to lay responsibility at her feet for a request that never made it onto her desk.
I think she pointed out that she had a number of conversations with Chris and that it did not, and security was not brought up.
Well, I'm not sure how many conversations I'm not sure how often she communicated with the ambassador. But I know she was quite clear that he never raised a security issue with her. I think the Accountability Review Board, which looked at this dispassionately and objectively, done by 2 career servants of this country, they concluded that decision to act on those requests was certainly a flawed decision by those who made it. But that was really not a decision to be made at the Secretary of State level.
And as she says, every recommendation has been implemented. Is that a fair statement?
It is a fair statement. Now, I think that she said when she left the State Department, they were all in the process of being implemented. Some, frankly, will take years to fully implement. She did mention during the hearing one that we in Congress, frankly, have slowed down and not fully implemented, and that is the establishment of a joint training center to train our diplomatic personnel, our security personnel. That's a project slated to be built in Virginia that Senator Tim Kaine has been advocating for quite some time. And if we were serious about embassy security as our committee lets on, we would get that project moving.
There is also the question of where does spontaneous reaction to a film, where does that go from being spontaneous in terms of the streets of Benghazi to a planned al-Qaeda attack or an al-Qaeda attack taking advantage of a spontaneous outburst?
Well, this is a subject that we covered in an investigation that lasted almost 2 years on the Intelligence Committee where I serve. And what we discovered in our investigation, and I think that's been verified by this new Select Committee as well, and that is that the intelligence we received in the hours after the attack was improved in the days after the attack and then changed yet again about a week after the attack. So initially, some of that very first intelligence that the Secretary got indicated this was a planned attack as she related to the Egyptian Prime Minister. But within about 24 to 48 hours, the CIA then assessed that actually, based on signals intelligence, human intelligence, open source intelligence, that it probably began as a protest that was hijacked into an attack. After, when we actually got the videos from the compound, and we could see in those videos that there was no protest outside the facility, that we were able to definitively conclude that this did not begin as a protest. But what I think is significant here is that if you look at what the Secretary said at the time she said it, much like if you look at what Ambassador Rice said at the time she said it, it was completely consistent with what our intelligence community was telling us at that time. You know, anyone that knows how the intelligence process works, particularly after a tragic event like this where you're in the fog of war, your assessments continue to evolve over time as you get more information. We in Congress, like the country after this tragedy, we're clamoring, what do we know? And, you know, a lot of our public officials were trying to tell us what they knew as soon as we knew it. Some of that proved to be wrong, but we found no evidence that there was any deliberate intent to deceive anyone.
But was it faulty intelligence?
Well, you know, it was faulty in the sense that some of it got it wrong. But I don't consider that an intelligence failure because, you know, what happens is here, initially you had one group that claimed responsibility. You had at the same time open source reporting that there were active protests going on. You had people on the ground who said that protests were going on. And so the intelligence is conflicting. The professionals, the analysts who look at all those streams of intelligence to try to figure out, okay, what really happened, their conclusion early on was it began as a protest. But then you get more definitive evidence, and in this case, that definitive evidence was the actual video, and that was, I think, quite compelling, and that showed us that, in fact, there was no protest.
And did the government in Libya tell the government in the United States that from the get-go that they thought it was a planned attack?
You know, I don't recall exactly what the view of the Libyan government was on that issue. I do recall that the Libyan government was really appalled at the violence and quite devastated that our ambassador was killed. And as the Secretary pointed out yesterday, there were tens of thousands of Libyans who took to the streets because they loved this man, to say, this is not us, this is not Islam. And I think the point that in those initial conversations between the Secretary, where she was trying to still get help and security with the Libyan government, they were trying to assure her just how appalled they were at this loss of life.
How do you think the Republicans on the committee, including Chairman Gowdy, view the committee hearing so far?
Well, I have to think that they're gravely disappointed at what happened yesterday. I think they were hoping, if not by dint of wearing down the Secretary by the skill of their cross-examination, that they would have had more to show, that they would have had some soundbite moment that would have played into the presidential campaign, or at least demonstrated that their committee had achieved something, because the reality is after 17 months they have nothing new to tell us about what actually happened that we didn't know already. So unless they can score something against the Secretary, there's not much that they can tell those who are urging the creation of this committee that justifies all the time and expense.
You're a Democrat and you're a politician. Secretary Clinton has had by the judgment of most political observers, a very good month. The debate and now this performance at the committee hearing. Has she essentially, in your judgment, wrapped up the nomination now?
Well, you know, I think in this kind of political environment, you can never say anyone's wrapped it up until you can see those electoral votes on the board. But she is a very strong candidate. She was at the outset. I think she's gotten even stronger after her debate performance and after, frankly, going through 11 hours of grilling and looking very presidential. She demonstrated a pretty comprehensive knowledge not only of our foreign policy, but how the State Department operates and a great respect for the people who serve overseas. So I think she looked very presidential. I think the members of our committee, frankly, looked very small in comparison. And so you have to conclude it was a pretty good month for the Secretary.
Congressman Schiff, thank you very much for joining us. I repeat that we hope to talk to one of the Republican members. We invited a number of them and hope to have them on as we have an ongoing conversation, you know, not only about this particular thing, but also other issues in Congress. Thank you very much for joining us.
You bet.